And welcome Real Leaders fans to this special interview with the Director of Philosophy at Patagonia, Vincent Stanley. Vincent, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And Vincent, just to give some viewers back home listening to this on audio as well, we are currently in Ventura, beautiful Ventura, California, at the Patagonia headquarters. And Vincent, you've been here for quite some time, haven't you?
Yeah, I started at the company 46 years ago when we were still a small mountain climbing equipment company. And it was that year that we pretty much started to create Patagonia, to create a clothing business. And I've had some time off for good behavior, but for most of those 46 years, I've worked here.
So you said it was a mountain climbing company. What was like the original intent and the original mission of Patagonia?
Well, I think it's important that we came out of climbing. So the founder, Yvon Chouinard, was a climber in his teens, and he couldn't find the equipment he needed capable of doing the big walls in Yosemite that he and his friends were pioneering at the time. So he borrowed $800 from his parents and bought a used drop forge, set up in the backyard, and started to make pitons that became well known for their quality. They were made out of hard steel, and they would last for infinite placements, as opposed to the pitons climbers had previously used, which only cost 15 cents, but they were malleable and they only worked one time. So when we got into clothing, I mean, it was interesting. If you start a clothing company from scratch, you can think about having your high-end line or your department store line, and then your whatever you want for the outlets. But if you're making climbing equipment, you can't think that way, because the customers are trusting their lives to what you're making. And the climbing world was so small at that time. I remember inspecting ice axes for hairline fractures and realizing that if I fell asleep on the job, I would hurt someone. And it wouldn't just be anyone, it would be a friend of a friend, or a friend of a friend of a friend, because the climbing world was that small. So when we got into clothing, and we got into clothing primarily to support the climbing equipment company. We had some wonderful share of the world market. I don't think anybody did any figures to evaluate what it was, but we definitely had a great reputation. We sold equipment around the world, and we could only really make 1% profit because, again, the world was so small and the investments in tools and dyes were so great. So part of the idea of getting into clothing was to get into a business that could be more profitable and could support the hardware. And we even thought of it as kind of our irresponsible business. I mean, clothing was easy, it didn't, cotton doesn't rust. We just thought of it as a kind of a soft business compared to what we were doing. We discovered very soon that we didn't know very much about the clothing business, that it was pretty hard, that we had a lot to learn. But I think we also never lost the habit of making the highest quality that we knew how to make. And that was still the origins. I make fun of us moving into what we call software, but in fact, the first clothes we made were rugged and durable and could withstand use on climbing in a chimney or exposure to stone.
And okay, so what I'm really taking from this is the climbing business, lives are on the line. You're talking about the hairline fracture, right. You mess this up, you just give someone a product that's not working, you could potentially kill someone when they're hundreds of feet up. And then you moved to the clothing business to support this business because it was easy and you knew some people in the area. And but how did that mission, that intent to protect these lives, how has it changed, or has it changed now in 2019 when you're one of the biggest clothing companies in the world?
It hasn't, we make a lot of technical clothing that support people in very difficult climates and in very difficult conditions. But for the most part, it's not the same as making hard goods. But at the same time, I think we developed the habit of making very high quality goods, and we never lost that.
Okay.
And the thing that's carried over for the whole time we've been in business is that all of our original employees, except for myself, were climbers and surfers. And there's something that happens to you, I think, when you're a mile from the road that your experience of the world really changes when you at once you feel more self-reliant, and then you're also more vulnerable to the forces of nature. It's a more beautiful world than the built world, and you have this real experience of wildness. And I think if you have that experience, you also feel the need to protect those places where you felt that. And that carried over into the clothing company. The fact that people really loved wilderness and nature and wanted to protect it. And that has never left us.
I was just going to say, me and my friend Noah right here, we were talking in the car coming up here. Noah's a city boy, he's from Pasadena. He hasn't really camped before. Do you think that's a problem that people are kind of missing in their lives, that spiritual connection to the outdoors?
I think if anybody who has that experience, again, they really value it.
Yeah.
And I think it is important for people to have, because it's hard to love a place where it's hard to defend nature if you don't have a kind of regard or a direct experience of it.
Yeah, I liked what you also said. It's more beautiful than the world that we built, because it's been evolving and changing for millions and millions of years. Where business is a little bit more brand new, but people and a lot of business owners aren't willing to maybe pay an extra penny for an organic or a fair trade fabric. How have your environmental, or how have the maybe this is a better question, are there any trade-offs for thinking about the environment and its impact versus your economic profitability?
I think I think they're more imagined than real.
Okay.
Going back, I think that one of the things that we actually learned a lot about business from having a kind of love of the wild and having that experience, because you become more adaptable when you're dealing with nature. And I think that helped us out in the early years of the company. But directly to your question, what's happened with us over time, so we would actually the way we've made decisions is perhaps a little different than other companies make decisions. When we decided to go to organic cotton, it's because we stumbled across the discovery that conventionally grown cotton involves so many toxic chemicals. And we decided, we really don't want to be responsible for using this cotton. It was something like at that time, 25% of all the chemicals used in agriculture were used on cotton, which was 8% of the land. And the more we investigated, if you go out to the cotton fields then and now, the organophosphates that are used for fertilizers were originally developed as nerve gases for World War I, and they smell that way. So what we did is we would discover something like that and say, okay, we really don't want to be doing this. We'll do whatever it takes to not do that. So we made a decision in 1994 to change our entire sportswear line over to organic cotton in an 18-month period. It was costly. It was difficult. We almost had a revolt on our hands from the employees who say, okay, I've got to do everything I did last season to develop the line, to design the clothes, to spec them and color them and take them to the major customers. And what you've done is you've ordered all of the cotton for our sportswear from organic farmers who have no connection to the global supply chain. They don't know the spinners who turn that fiber into yarn. They don't know the mills and the that turn that into a knit or a woven. And so what we would do is actually take employees out 40 at a time to the cotton fields to experience what these conventional fields were like, to go by the ponds that were so polluted with selenium that the farmers hired old guys with shotguns to warn off the birds so they wouldn't land on them. And people would come back from these trips and say, this is a real pain, but this is worth it, and we want to help the company achieve this. So what's happened over time, I apologize for the long answer to your question, but I think what's happened over time is that every time we give ourselves some sort of constraint that other businesses and we ourselves might regard as kind of a risk, we learn to innovate, and that innovation has become now the business model for the company. Another example is if I were in the fashion business and I went to FIT in New York, I could choose from hundreds of fabrics from their fabric library to develop a sportswear line. And if I'm from Patagonia, there are only a handful of fabrics that I can look at because we're concerned about the chemicals used in the dyes or the labor conditions in the mills. But we know those fabrics really well, and we know the mills that make those fabrics really well. And that depth of knowledge actually helps us develop new kinds of fabrics that perform in a different way.
So you have a stronger relationship with your suppliers now because of, and your workers as well, by going to these places, seeing how they're made, seeing what's important and what's, I guess maybe what's the right thing to do.
Right. And those relationships are important. At one point we had, when we were half the size we are now, or a third the size we are now, we had over 150 garment sewing factories that we dealt with, and we cut that down to 45 just so we could have a close relationship. So again, sort of back to your question, is it a trade-off between a business goal and an environmental goal? And I think the correct answer is that if you integrate your social and your environmental goals into your business strategy, it's not a trade-off at all. It's a parallel development. It's a strategic development of your company that takes advantage of the relationships and the knowledge that you gain by taking a certain tack.
Right. And to go one step further, you were just mentioning, I believe, Patagonia was able to do that because of the high quality products when you started. So it was an easy transition to maintain that intention to protect the planet and go to a sustainable source because of your values with nature.
Right, and because of the owners. I mean, Patagonia is still owned by the Chenard family, and that those values were so strongly held by the people who owned the stock and who made the decisions. They were also very strongly held by the people in the middle of the company. So the culture always supported these decisions, even when they were difficult, as I mentioned with organic cotton. That may have been the most difficult transition we ever made.
And when we think of the fashion industry right now, I believe Patagonia uses 69% recyclable fabrics, garments for their clothing products, whereas the industry standard is about, I think it's 13 or 11. But you've also made the pledge, or the company has made the pledge to go 100% by a certain year. I can't remember what that is. But what's the strategy behind that? And do you think the industry as a whole will reach that 100% mark by a certain year eventually?
That's a great question. I don't know about the industry. For us, we've committed to becoming carbon neutral by 2025. But I think more important than that, we've identified, in terms of our environmental footprint, our impact, 85% of that comes from textiles. It comes from the fabrics, and that doesn't even include zippers and trims. About half the line comes out of a field in the form of cotton or hemp, and about half the line comes out of an oil well.
And for people listening to this back home, we're talking about coal emissions, right? CO2 being produced by coal and the textile manufacturers. We're talking about transportation trucks. Okay.
And when we're talking about nylon or polyester, they're coming directly out of an oil well.
Right.
Even though we use recycled content. So we have a kind of twin goals. One is we're very interested and invested in the idea of regenerative organic agriculture for cotton and hemp, and also for our little food company, Patagonia Provisions, because it takes the organic standard one step farther. Organic really just covers you in terms of chemicals. It says, okay, we're not going to use chemicals for fertilizer or pesticides. But regenerative organic is a standard that says, okay, we're going to pay attention to everything that creates soil health, from crop rotation to intercropping to companion planting to everything, to using deeper rooted plants. And when you actually bring the soil back to health, it has a tremendous capacity to absorb carbon, to sequester carbon and draw it deep into the ground. So we're very interested in this, especially for cotton. We have an experimental program going right now in India. And we see this as the future for the fibers that we farm. For polyester and nylon, it's a kind of a different question. It's what we would like to do is either make everything out of 100% recycled plastic, make it out of trash, or make it out of some biological source. It doesn't necessarily displace land use for food. So that's our goal also by 2025. And whether the industry can come around to that, what we would hope is that, for other companies, they may view this as a tremendous risk. We don't view it as a tremendous risk because this is the way we've been doing business for a long time. So we hope if we can prove successful and get our work done well, that others will follow.
And you touched on the point with the B Corps and shareholder pressure, and I want to go over that. I want to go right back to that.
Yeah.
Does your company, Patagonia, being a certified B Corporation, do you feel less shareholder pressure than, say, a company who is an S Corp or a C Corp, in terms of the decisions that you make with your stakeholders and environmental costs?
Yeah, we feel no pressure because but it has more to do with the fact that we're family owned by a family that's strongly committed to these values.
Okay.
Where being a B Corp really helps us, though, is that the B Lab impact assessment, which all B Corps have to take regularly, is the only holistic look that we have at all of our business practices on how we affect employees, how we affect the community, how we affect nature. And it's become really valuable to us. So we've upped our score every, they have a score from 0 to 200. You have to reach a score of 80 to become a B Corp. We've kind of climbed up the ladder, but it really helps, that assessment helps us look at where we think we have work to do, and then we'll go ahead and make changes. You mentioned our high use of recycled content, and we were patting ourselves on the back because most of our products that are made of polyester were recycled or had recycled content. But using the impact assessment, we looked at it by weight and said, we're kidding ourselves because some of our best products, our best-selling products, are completely virgin. Oh. And when we discovered that, we made a switch within a year or two to recycled content for those.
Virgin just being just polyester, non-recycled.
Out of the oil well.
Okay, because I saw in the handbook that you made in 2014, Patagonia didn't do as well on the B impact assessment as the year prior. What decisions did Patagonia make after that realization to then increase that score, and did it have an effect?
Well, I think we did, overall we went up, but we went down in certain categories.
Okay.
Yeah, and I don't remember I don't remember the circumstances on that. So.
Okay. But it might be a good assessment each year after you take it to realize maybe where you're having an impact and where you can improve
exactly.
on. Okay. And do you think all businesses can be a B corporation?
Well, it's interesting. I would have said no 2 years ago, but we're seeing now a tremendous amount of interest from businesses of all size. And a couple of big examples are Unilever. Unilever, several subsidiaries have become B Corps, and Unilever has identified what they regard as their sustainable businesses as supplying half of their profit, half of their growth. Danone is another example. It's a French company, yogurt, Danone yogurt and Evian water and a bunch of baby food brands. And their CEO is committed to making all of Danone a B Corp. And that's a 26 billion euro company the last time I looked. And the interesting thing is that they bought, in Danone a year and a half ago, bought White Wave, which was the largest organic dairy company in the United States. That's a $6 billion company. It was about 6 times the size of any existing B Corp. And Danone brought in a woman named Lorna Davis, who had once run Nabisco in China, and a very capable person, and they embedded her in the B Lab offices in New York and said, let's figure out how we can work with B Lab to actually intelligently assess a company this size. They thought it would take 3 years. They did it in 1 year. And Lorna attributes that quick turnaround to the commitment of the younger people in the company. There was 100 people involved in gathering the data and doing the work to make it a B Corp. At the same time, Emmanuel Fabe said he was getting a loan from a consortium of 12 banks for 2 billion euros. And the terms of the loan, the interest rate is reduced for every subsidiary that becomes a B Corp because the banks assess less risk because of better governance, basically better governance and less risk from B Corp. So that's a big change. And there's also evidence that B Corp startups have a higher survival rate than non-B Corps. So I think people are beginning to look at this as this is not just a way to do something good on the side and market it. This is really a way to do business.
And governance being a big part of that.
Governance being a big part of it. But it's also, I think, it's really formed by, I think there's a gradual realization, and I've seen it's gradual for a long time, but I've seen it gathering steam over the last few years regarding both climate change and also social inequity, which is tearing at the fabric of the developed world. And what are the responsibilities of individuals, of civil society, which includes NGOs and families and non-governmental organizations, but also what are the responsibilities of business when you have a crisis like that?
Right.
Then my sense is that every business has kind of a twofold responsibility. One is, in developing its future, how can we develop products and services that are actually going to help us all help our grandchildren thrive in the next 30, 40 years? And then 2, how do we deliver in a way that reduces our impact on nature and also that has a positive effect on our communities and our employees rather than an extractive negative effect? Right. So that's where I think business responsibility lies, and I noticed that you have on the back of your spring 2019 the SDGs.
All of them. Yeah.
All 17. You know, that's a tremendous boon to business. It wasn't designed for business people. It was designed for all the forces in society. But what it means is 183 countries have signed on to an understanding of what we need to do by 2030 in order to address the world's most significant problems. So I think a combination of looking at the SDGs and looking at the B Lab impact assessment, business people really have guideposts that they did not have before 2015, before 2012.
Now let's get forward 4 months from now.
Yeah.
2020, big year coming up.
Right.
What's your advice to business leaders, and how might they be able to take that next step in terms of the governance that we were just talking about?
Well, it depends on, it depends on what kind of business we're talking about. I mean, I think that there's, for most existing businesses, I think everybody's been grappling with the idea of purpose. And purpose is kind of broadly, it's never used very specifically. Mm-hmm. But I think what it means is that businesses look at the world and they see the depth of the challenges and they say, we've got to figure out who we are in order to navigate this territory, even before we talk about being a good guy or how we're going to be a good citizen player. We have to figure out who we are just in order to do business in the future. And I think that that's a great exercise, but I think when you identify your purpose, you also have to identify the purposes you're going to serve. And so I think that that's an important second step for businesses that are going through that process.
Now, as a publication, I have to be fair, so here's the question. Yeah. Oil, as much carbon dioxide emissions it does put out, it has done a lot of good things for economic development in countries, in businesses, technology, innovation. Yeah. Is there a trade-off if we were to decrease the oil consumption and go to an alternative energy as a plant, as a whole, and as a business?
I think it's an interesting question, but you have to divide the answer up into what's possible and then what seems politically possible at the moment. Right. Because I think all the indications are that you could certainly begin to severely reduce fossil fuel use and increase the use of alternative sources of energy, especially from wind. Solar is developing storage capacity, and people can, do what we're doing. Look at where your biggest impacts are coming from, and then start to chip away at it.
Right.
But you need the political will. You need the political will to start to move in that direction. We don't even have we have socialized. We have private profits and socialized costs. So everyone is bearing the cost of the pollution and the warming atmosphere, but nobody's charging the people who are responsible for that.
It's really interesting. We have even though we are, a Sustainable Business Leadership magazine, we have a ton of climate deniers on our Facebook page, on that comment all the time. Yeah. And when I say climate deniers, it doesn't actually mean they don't think the climate is changing. They just think the climate's always been changing. What evidence have you come across that's really made you convinced that we need to limit our impact on the environment, that the climate is changing because of carbon dioxide emissions?
Well, I think that we even see we've been talking since 1991 about the environmental crisis. Mm-hmm. And we see the environmental crisis as even larger than climate. Almost first and foremost is the loss of biodiversity. Every living system depends on every part of that system. And so, the butterflies arrive in the Jackson Valley at a certain point so that the grass will grow and the buffalo will feed on it. When you start to thin out the web of life, and it's something we're not conscious of because we're in a room with lights and a water faucet, we're not conscious of natural systems, but when those systems start to get frayed, we all become more vulnerable, including human beings. So that's the first thing. We've lost something like half the mammal species in the last 50 years. We've lost insect populations. bees, which are responsible for 30 to 40% of food supply, are endangered. So, and then when you get to the issue of the warming climate, the real issue are the gases that are warming the atmosphere, that are creating the warmer climate down here. And then the two forms that take are more extreme weather events, and I think there's an awful lot of evidence for that. And the second is rising sea level, and it's incontrovertible that sea levels are rising. The question is how fast. You can play with statistics, but I think it's pretty overwhelming that actually the predictions that have been made for melting ice caps and all that are actually, the reality is worse than what the predictions were. The evidence starts to get real too, I think, for people. You might question, okay, is it climate or is it climate? Is it weather or is it climate? But if you were in Puerto Rico and you didn't have electricity for 6 months, or you were here in December of 2017 with a wildfire in December that ran 50 miles, displaced 75% of our employees from their homes. We had people working in kitchens to move inventory and pay the bills, and then they'd have to move the next day to someone else's kitchen because the smoke would come in on that community. If you were in the wealthy neighborhood of Houston and suddenly learned that you were in the path of a dam that broke. So I think that the more incidents that we have, the less room people will have to kind of deny the changes that are upon us. And again, it's not just climate, it's biodiversity loss, it's acidification of the oceans, it's the loss of fresh water, which is going to challenge China and the Soviet Union and the United States, Ogallala Aquifer. It's the loss of soil. It's the pollution of water from agriculture. So all of those things constitute the crisis. And I think it's much harder to see. In 1973, when I started here, Earth Day was 3 years old. But it was still true in those days that if I drove the van to LA from here, I could expect my eyes to be watering when I got out, because the smog was so bad. You could dip, my favorite horror story, you could dip black and white film into Lake Ontario and pull it out and it would have an image because the chemicals in it were so bad. We're so close to those in the developer bath. But clean air, clean water, these were great laws that we passed in the 70s, but I think that they also concealed some of the underlying problems that we're just using natural resources at a faster rate than we can replenish them, and we're also poisoning the earth faster than the earth can recover from.
Yeah, it's an interesting argument because they say, I've done some research, I have to know their side, how they think. So they say, post-industrialization, the temperature dropped in 1970, 1980, like 3 degrees, and now it's back up. Whereas I say, and what research says, in the last 3 decades, which is actually 1990, we've done more damage, and we've almost quadrupled our carbon emissions in these last couple of years. And that's why temperatures are rising and causing all these things like ocean acidification, extreme weather events, 150 million projected refugees by 2050. There's a lot of big problems, and that's why the United Nations set those goals to combat all these different things. But it is an interesting topic. So I guess when we're trying to think of solutions, there's no one-size-fit-all approach. There never will be. But as someone listening to this, is this an individual issue? Is this something that I need to be learn about where to recycle my clothes at? Or is this an individual issue that I need to take to my business to then structure something that could have a potentially a greater impact?
It's kind of, the answer is everybody.
Everyone's got to pitch in.
But there are all kinds of areas where different parts of society are influential. Of course, when government sets a policy, that moves it. When China decides they're going to stop building coal plants, they're responsible for twice the amount of emissions that we are. That will be huge. But business is something like 80% of the carbon is really, it's produced by businesses, you know.
Right.
And consumers and citizens play a big role, because if everybody refuses to use single-use plastic, then businesses have to follow suit. But businesses can also act on their own. Mm. And it's really important that we do so, because we're the ones that create these products that create the waste.
And that's what's interesting, because capitalism, I don't think capitalism has ever been 100% sustainable, because it's always changing. There's always uncertainty with what politicians are doing. Hence, what China just lowered their currency by 7 cents the other day. That's going to affect American businesses. Mm-hmm. It's going to affect maybe your business. Who knows? How when I think of sustainability, obviously I think it's the right thing to do. Do you think this is a long-form approach, and do you think this is possible for businesses in the long term?
Well, I think it is. I mean, when you get down to it, there's this law, the second law of thermodynamics, that you don't get rid of waste. But on the other hand, it's interesting when you look at the word sustainable. When Ivo and I wrote a book called The Responsible Company, and we avoided the use of the word sustainability, because we thought, we called it The Responsible Company because we thought we can be responsible. We can look at what we're doing and make the changes that are possible to be made at a certain time. And in that we have agency, and we accept responsibility for what we're doing. But nothing we were doing then, and not much of what we're doing now, could be regarded as sustainable, in the sense that we're actually giving back to the planet more than we're taking. Mm. But when we look at the potential for sustainable agriculture, when we look at the idea of regenerative agriculture, that really is. If we create topsoil, we can create it a lot faster than nature can. We're actually giving back to the planet as much or more than we're taking. So that's kind of our new North Star. But it made me think about the whole idea of sustainability, and I think people still think of sustainability as a kind of the moderate approach, and regenerative as the more radical, or there are more things you have to do because it's more of a holistic look at things. But to me, I think you actually get to sustainability through regenerative action. That's really what we need to be thinking about, is how do we restore nature? How do we restore human communities, which are fractured, and we've taken a lot from them? Globalism has been good in a lot of ways, but it has really hurt civil society. It's really hurt the family. It's really hurt local communities.
Vincent, we talked a lot today about fair trade, polyester, kind of how Patagonia started with rock climbing, and how you're able to charge a high quality product, and how that kind of led into the ability to sustain that purpose of protecting the planet. I guess not my last question, my second last question I have for you is, business owners listening to this right now, especially in fashion, startups, got plenty of friends trying to build a fashion company right now, what's one piece of advice that you give them to have them take that next step towards a mission maybe like Patagonia's?
Well, for startups, I think that we talked earlier about what would established companies do next, and we talked about this idea of purpose. And I think if you're starting a business now, it's really important to understand what's unique about your operation. Mm-hmm. I mean, every company is like every person is different, and every snowflake, well, so is every business and every business culture. Okay. So what makes your little beginning business an individual? And what is something that, how do you want to cultivate that individuality over time? What are the values that you hold dearest? And how are you going to build your business in coherence with those values, and to act out those values and help other people act on those values? And I would do that all at the beginning. I wouldn't say, okay, I'm getting started, so I'm going to kind of go off base here, and when I get to be 5 million, or I get to be 10 million, or 50 billion, or 50 million, I'm going to decide to start to be a good person, right? Or I'm going to start to give money to 1% for the planet then. It's much easier to set these expectations among all of your constituencies, among all your stakeholders, your investors, your employees, your customers, your suppliers, right at the beginning, so that everybody knows that language, and if you're consistent over time, everybody begins to respect it, and it helps build a business. So I think it's much better to do that, to go through those sometimes difficult steps. But I also think that's why B Corp startups are doing better than other companies, because people are looking at those important questions about social, environmental, and impact from the beginning. And how are you going to govern your company? How are you going to run it?
Well said, Vincent. Thanks for answering that question. And you started out this conversation with your love for the outdoors, with that experience that you had being surfers and climbers and building this company for those people. Mm-hmm. The earth has finite resources, and you were a leader in this space by saying, we're going to take action on this issue. So the last question I have for you, Vincent, is what is your definition of a real leader?
Well, I think people conflate leadership with individual leaders. And I think that a real leadership is actually exercised by groups of people and by teams. And so, in the sense of the individuals who are running those teams or running those groups, it's how are they able to identify the strengths and the values and help those people act on them. I think that's pretty important.
I like that a lot. So people listening out there, leadership, it's not as individual, it might be a little bit more holistic. Vincent, thank you so much for your time today. I had a pleasure speaking with you about Patagonia. Thanks for letting us into this beautiful headquarters here in Ventura, California. If you're listening to this on audio, make sure you go online to real-leaders.com. You can check out this full interview on there, also on YouTube and on Facebook. And Vincent, any last words about where people can find more information about Patagonia?
Well, the website, we've got a kind of a wealth of information at patagonia.com. There's an awful lot written about us. We even wrote a book called Let My People Go Surfing that's in its second edition now. The Responsible Company covers a lot of this. So anyway, but thanks for listening. Thanks for coming to Ventura and talking to us.
Absolutely. For Vincent Stanley, I'm Kevin Edwards, telling you to always keep it real. Thank you. Vincent, thank you so much, man. That was great.